Hello, welcome to this Institute for Government event on the end of the generalist in the civil service. And it's good to see so many generalists in the room today, and I count myself as one of them. My name is Alex Thomas. I'm a Programme Director here at the IFG, and I'm really looking forward to a discussion about the civil service policy profession, how we build the right skills for policymakers in government, and whether we can or should finally put to bed the old specialist-generalist distinction. And we've got a fantastic group to answer that question. Dame Tamara Finkelstein is the Permanent Secretary of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, if my throat holds out. That's not a great start, is it? I've got some Strepsils in my pocket. And importantly for our purposes, she's the head of the civil service policy profession. She's also had senior jobs at the Treasury, the Communities Department and the Department of Health and Social Care. Erin Maniam is the Fellow of Practice and Director of Digital Transformation Education at the Blavatnik School of Government. As well as teaching at Blavatnik, he's involved with the World Economic Forum, the OECD, was a senior official in the Singaporean government, and all sorts of other leadership roles in the technology and digital world. And Lord Vallance, Patrick Vallance, is the Minister of State for Science, Research and Innovation. And if you look at his bio, I think, Patrick, you had basically every sort of job that there is going, a mix of academic, business, government work, and was, of course, I assume, reluctant familiar face during the COVID pandemic. Before we get going, first call for questions. Get thinking in the room here, and for those tuning in remotely, use the Slido function on your screens. And if you can, when you ask a question, say who you are and what organisation you're from, and uprate the question so that I can see and try and ask them. We're going to hear from Tamara first, who will set out her thoughts about the future of the policy profession, the question we're here to talk about. And then we'll move to a discussion picking up her themes. And I should say at the start that Patrick has to leave for the dispatch box at the House of Lords at 10:45. So he'll slip out just before the end, and I'll try and get to questions as early as I can, so you get a chance to ask him some questions. Over to you, Tamara.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thank you for this opportunity to have this discussion. I've been looking forward to it. So a decade and a half ago, I was recruiting to a role in one of my teams in the Treasury, and the role was the Treasury accountant. It was an ancient role going back centuries, and I decided to take a bold and innovative step. For the first time ever, I would recruit a qualified accountant, rather than a generalist with an ability to turn their hand to anything. The job involved managing all the government's cash and financial accounts. It may have been unconventional, but it seemed prudent to me. Around that time, and people may remember it, there was a change in the rules requiring finance directors of government departments for the first time to have a finance qualification. It was very controversial, and my memory is that the first set of externally appointed, financially qualified recruits was not a success. They looked at the way government did finance and said it was mad. They disregarded the context and found themselves sidelined and left in frustration. The next set of recruits looked at government finance with interest. They probably also thought government finance rules were a little mad, but they asked questions, they understood the context, and successfully made improvements, joined by civil servants who chose to take finance qualifications. No one now makes the argument that civil servants doing finance roles in government do not need to be professionally qualified. Some will be very specialised in forensic accounting or fraud, others will apply broader knowledge and experience, but all within the framework of the finance profession. Over a short time, finance in government has been transformed. But policy making in government is at the start of this journey. While learning is on offer, we require no specific qualifications, no licence to operate, no continuous professional development. Many in policy roles define themselves as generalists and are not part of any professional community. So my argument today is that while generalist skills are essential, civil service generalists who sit outside any profession make it harder for the civil service to be more skilled and effective, and that holds us back from delivering better outcomes for citizens. The policy profession can be the home for many who define themselves as generalists, where the broad and deep skills can be learned, practiced, and developed as part of a profession. And the policy profession has an ambitious plan to build individual and organisational capability in the civil service, which has already started, but may take a decade to complete. Let me start with the argument for the generalist. So what is a generalist? A generalist usually refers to someone with a wide range of skills and knowledge across a range of subject areas. In the civil service, a generalist tends to have built skills in democracy, understanding the parliamentary, government and political system, often applying these skills across a range of policy areas, moving frequently from role to role and department to department. The generalist will be valued for their judgment and for an ability to be a fixer in a complex political and policy context. There is great value in these skills. Being able to apply them at pace to different problems, understanding what ministers need, navigating the system to deliver that, setting up effective governance arrangements. In medicine and probably some other professions, there's a strong and powerful argument that there are not enough generalists and too many specialists. Without the generalist approach, there's a danger that no one looks at the whole person they are treating. In the world of policy making, where all interesting problems are systems problems, there's a strong argument for the skills that enable you to look at the whole problem and to build a multidisciplinary team to solve it. But there are downsides to the generalist as we have it in the civil service outside of professions. First, a lack of structured learning. Over the 3 decades I've been in the civil service, formal learning has fallen away, and while on-the-job learning is helpful, it is not enough on its own. Generalists that sit outside the professions tend not to access structured learning, but generalist skills are still skills, and they require definition and must be learned and practiced. Second, rapid movement between jobs. Moving between different jobs rapidly is regarded as the privilege of the generalist. And in the early stages of a career, this mobility can be used to build knowledge and skills if it's done with care and structured learning. At more senior levels, though, it can be difficult to develop knowledge and make and sustain relationships with experts. Third, I'd say there's a problem of limited diversity. Generalists are often regarded as practicing a dark art, open to those who are more confident at managing without the framework of other professions, the preserve of those who just seem to know how to do it. And this leads to a lack of diversity in background and in thought. So my proposition is that while generalist skills are important, they need to be practiced as part of a profession that provides a framework for learning, transparent career development, and preferably transferable qualifications. And for that, the civil service needs a strong policy profession. Now, the policy profession in government has made huge strides since it was established over a decade ago. We've established high-quality masters and postgraduate diploma courses in partnership with world-class universities, alongside an excellent policy apprenticeship. We've also created other learning opportunities, including leaders teaching leaders, making use of the senior expertise in policy making, reunion-style sessions to learn and share lessons, and the annual policy festival with accomplished panels, bite-sized learning and mini-coaching sessions. The policy profession standards that we brought out a few years ago has 3 pillars: strategy, democracy and delivery, and sets out the skills that you need to be a policy professional at different levels, developing, practitioner and expert, and there's related guidance on career pathways. The skills, often considered the preserve of the generalist, are threaded throughout that framework. And many of these learning offers are open and relevant for other professions seeking to build the skills of policy making, because being a policy maker is not the preserve of policy professionals alone. That said, the policy profession needs to take the next step from being simply a community of practice. a voluntary gathering of those with an interest in policy making, to being a profession with requirements to meet standards and complete continuous professional development. Recruitment to civil service roles must require evidence that these standards have been met. So over the next decade, we will deliver a plan that puts building capability at the heart of the profession. And the good news is that we have made a start. First, the fast stream no longer has a generalist brand. Applicants choose a profession to major in when they apply, including government policy or operational delivery. This doesn't prevent them moving across professions. There's a considerable shared learning between those programmes, but it creates the expectation of a career-long commitment to professional capability building. Second, we are developing a common policy profession induction programme and Policy 101, and we'll expect everyone in the profession to complete these. Third, we're piloting an approach to continuous professional development, with senior civil servants starting on that journey in which they commit to personal development plan with specified learning, both formal and on the job. And the annual policy festival run by the profession has sessions, for example, that will give CPD credits. And fourth, we're using a tool to help departments to self-assess with external peer scrutiny their effectiveness in policy development, a form of policy capability review, and based on this, departments can put in place an improvement plan, for example, to raise data literacy. And a number of departments have already gone through that and have put in place plans to make improvements. And there are further initiatives underway, including exploring what does it mean to be a qualified policy professional? How will we test that standards have been met? And how might we make this qualification available to others in the economy working on policy? And we've got an external advisory panel helping with this work, including experts from the accountancy and HR professions. We are supporting sub-professions and communities that will come under the umbrella of the policy profession. For example, we're building a cohort of colleagues with deep knowledge of climate and environment who might move jobs and departments, but they would, while deepening their subject expertise and external relationships. And this might be the solution to the problem of frequent changes in jobs. And we're also building a community of strategy experts and developing our capability to do long-term strategic thinking. And I have a thought that this concept of sub-communities within the policy profession may be an important way forward. And we're looking at how we train policy professionals to be experts in building and leading multidisciplinary teams. It always strikes me that when we appoint management consultants at great expense, one of their key skills is to appraise the issue and build a team of scientists, analysts, policy, operational delivery and other professionals to solve the problem. We do that, but we don't teach it, and we don't do that as well as we could. We should build that capability internally. So this is an ambitious plan, and we're only at the start. The skills of the generalist remain valuable, but we will make those skills more transparent, make it clearer how they can and should be built within the framework of the policy profession. We will help those sub-professions like climate and environment build their policy skills while deepening their specialist knowledge and relationships. And through all of this, we'll make the policy profession more accessible and thus more diverse. And as we establish a floor of basic capabilities and raise the ceiling with postgraduate accredited learning, we'll equip our colleagues for the policy challenges ahead. I want to see a one big sign-on requiring every civil servant to sign up to a profession or be part of a function that provides a framework of learning, an amnesty for the generalist. We shouldn't shut down the ability to move between professions and functions, but that should not just be the preserve of the generalist. Transparent skills frameworks will support that mobility by giving people demonstrated expertise that they can take with them when they move. Our ambition is to deliver better outcomes for citizens. To do that, we all have to be truly excellent at the work that we do And that means transforming our approach to what it means to be professional. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tamara. Really interesting and lots of stuff for us to get our teeth into there. I was going to ask you one quick follow-up question. It actually reflects one of the questions that's already come in online, which is you talked about high turnover and churn in the policy profession, and you talked about skills. I'm interested in your thoughts as to how that relates to sort of actual knowledge and expertise and the networks that you build by being in one area. How do you see managing the sort of hopefully creative tension between people moving around and picking up new knowledge, but while having deep enough knowledge and expertise and networks to sort of actually give ministers the best advice and implement things?
Yes. So, I mean, I don't think there's been any sort of assessment of the civil service that doesn't conclude people move around too quickly, but doesn't often say, like, so what do we do about it? And it strikes me that, as you said, some of the moving around, particularly early stage of your career, enables you to pick up, how do you do legislation? How do ministers work in a private office? And different departments. One of the idea of trying this thing on climate and environment is, well, what if you did climate and environment and actually you could move, you could be in Department for Transport, Treasury, Defra, DESNES, you could go to different departments, you could do different roles, but maybe if you were all the time deepening your climate and environment knowledge, that might, and those relationships, because I think that's important, and porosity of potentially getting people coming in to do some of those roles from outside, you could potentially get both. So that's what we're basically piloting it, doing that. Is that the way forward? And I think we then need to think that in most areas, as you sort of get more senior, you deepen that knowledge and might move around a bit less. So I do think there's a question there as to what do we require of people in terms of the length of time they might stay in role at more senior levels.
And another quick one, which I'll ask because it's been overwhelmingly popular online again already, and we hear a lot of this. How can the civil service policy profession hire the right candidates if the hiring process continues to be formulaic and archaic and unable to recognise specialist skills? The whole sort of success profiles question. Thoughts on recruitment and hiring, and then I'll come to Patrick.
Yeah, well, I think we are looking at our processes on that because they are clunky, and that is kind of a universal concern. I agree in how we look at that. I do think that actually having a bit more of a kind of professional framework that sort of that recognises the skills that people have in their profession and in their domain could help with changes that we might make on recruitment.
Yeah, it all links together, doesn't it? Patrick, you're a civil servant, you're now a minister. Strikes me you're sort of almost perfectly positioned to see as a sort of insider-outsider about the skills of the civil service and how this problem manifests itself, but also the opportunities for change. So really interested in your reaction to everything that Tamara said, but also kind of reflecting on your personal experiences of the service you get from the civil service now as a minister.
Yeah, I really like what Tamara had to say, and I will start with in defence of moving around a bit, because I think at an early stage of a career, it's actually rather helpful to do a few things and see what's out there. And then there's a need, I think, to become specialist in something. Because if you're not specialist in something, you don't know what specialism means. And that is in itself a problem. Because specialism comes with things that are risks as well as opportunities, and you need to understand where to probe when you've got a specialist in front of you. Where is it likely that that person may not have the answer or may not know what the solution to the problem you've got in front of you are. So I think there's something about a breadth at the beginning and then going into something to be specialist. And then my second point, which is something I definitely learned in my 5 years as Government Chief Scientific Advisor, and I've seen it even more in the ministerial role, is it's very easy to assume that policy is just sort of general knowledge. Because there's a bit of everybody, the man or the woman in the pub thinks they can make up policy. You know, they know what to do. It's all pretty straightforward, actually.
Common sense.
Taxi drivers.
Yeah, and you know, the thing I've really learned is that there is such a thing as really being a professional specialist in policy. And we should recognise that and celebrate that, because it's difficult and it comes with all sorts of trade-offs and things that you know about. So I think there is something about recognising that policy itself is a specialism. And then there's the big question of, you know, how do you make sure that in a world where, you know, I can't think of a single government area of work where science, technology and innovation doesn't make a difference. Now, how do you harness that? Because you need it in the system. It doesn't mean that everybody needs to be a scientist, but it does mean that whoever's dealing with those areas needs to understand how to access that information, how to access the expertise, and importantly, how to challenge appropriately. And that's where I think some of the things that Tamara was talking about, of developing true policy expertise, but then giving people enough of the experience in a given area, not too narrow, means that they could probably be more effective at garnering all those other inputs.
Yeah, really interesting. There's, again, reflecting both on your sort of observation but personal experience, it's a popular question here as well. If policy becomes more professionalised, how can it remain open to applications from outside the civil service, bearing in mind certain experiences only gained within the civil service? You were obviously somebody who came in at a senior level into a specialist job from outside the civil service. What was your experience of that, and how do you think the civil service can remain open to bringing in those talented?
Well, the chief scientific advisor's appointments in department or the government chief scientific advisor's appointment are deliberately from outside because they bring a sort of challenge to the system, and they become a specialism inevitably, and that is an important part of it, and we need a lot of that in the civil service. We need people to come from outside with specialist skills. They might not have a total 40-year career in the civil service, and indeed for the chief scientific advisors it's normal to do 3 years, maybe 2 sets of 3 years if you're a departmental one, and 5 if you're the GCSA. And I think that's right. You don't want somebody there for 20 years, you want somebody there for 5 years bringing an outside look in and being able to bring that expertise. But I think for the policy profession, I don't see any reason why you can't recruit from outside, because to the point that Tamara's raised, there should be continuing professional development, ability to train somebody in this, and to get them to develop those specialist skills once they're in post, which I think is important. And coming with an outside expertise across a range of areas will be beneficial if you then come in to be a policy expert. So I would have thought this opens this up to lots of people, actually.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I mean, I think from what Tamara and you just said, there's being clearer about what the job is should make it easier to recruit people, because you can also then hopefully sidestep some of the verbiage around kind of recruitment and job adverts and that kind of stuff, which goes to the other.
And ideally, I think you'd want people to come in, go out again to something else. They might go into a different part of the public sector, the private sector, somewhere else. They might come back again at some point. We're not in the era now where most people start in a job at their 20s and finish in their 60s, and they've been in the same place. People are in and out of different sectors, and we need much more of that. So I think openness to that is going to be important, and not just openness, but facilitating that.
That's great. Aaron, interested in your general reactions to what Tamara said, and Patrick's comments there as well, but particularly thinking about the policy profession and data, and how you might integrate those two and give policy professionals the skills to do that. And also with your Singaporean experience, which is always interesting to hear sort of comparison points and differences.
Yeah, no, thanks, Alex. Really happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I had 4 broad reactions actually to what Tamara was saying, and they were reinforced listening to what Patrick outlined. Maybe I'll just walk through those first, and there'll be a lot of Singaporean examples in that. The first is this idea that policy is itself a specialism, and I couldn't agree more with Patrick on that. The head of civil service in Singapore, when I first joined government in 2004, said to all of us who were part of what we then called the Management Associates Program. It was a feeder into a program we called the Administrative Service, which is something we actually learned from the UK, but it's kind of the equivalent of Fast Stream now, but something we do for life, right, throughout our careers. And there's about 300 of us who are these administrative officers. It's a really dull name when you think about it, but that's the point of it, right? Because it's not meant to be about highfalutin glory. But he told us that administrative officers are not generalists, because that was often how we got painted. But his point was that we were specialists in the business of government. And it's really worth reflecting on what that means, right? What does it mean to be a specialist in that business? I think it means, rather than being a specialist in a domain like education or infrastructure, it means understanding interconnections, understanding trade-offs and how to manage them, which are a key part of the vocabulary, right, of a policy practitioner. Knowing how to work with political office holders, parliament, and the other institutions of state, as well as citizen stakeholders. And then understanding the link that policy is not just about ideas, it's also about delivery and operations. Those aspects transcend all parts of government and all domains. But I think that was part of what he was saying when the idea of policy as a specialism actually took root quite early on in Singapore. So part of my responses to the title of this session was, I don't know if the generalist is dead or not, but I mean, I'm not sure the generalist ever was alive in the civil service. In practice, we've all had to be specialists in many different areas. The second point, which links to this, is then the fact that we found that as we move around different job rotations in Singapore, we have to learn to be specialists in multiple domains very, very fast. And part of this is reflected in higher remuneration for this group. But it's also reflected in the fact that this is a group that is meant to see connections and trade-offs. And when they're posted to be Director of Policy in Education or Director of Joint Coordination in the Home Office or our equivalent of it, then you're meant to learn that specialism quickly, but bring the benefits of that breadth and interconnection that you also have as a specialist in the policy domain. I thought I'd say one other thing here about this movement across domains, right, which hasn't been mentioned so far, and that's kind of the system value of it. We found in Singapore that one thing that's really valuable is after you've done 3 or 4 job rotations and you don't know what your 5th is going to be, you start to try making decisions in a very system level because you don't know if you're the one who's going to have to bear the consequences of that decision later on, right? And it's a very useful corrective against much more tough-minded decision-making. My nerdy academic side likes to call this the organizational equivalent of the Roljan veil of ignorance, right? Because you don't know where you're going to end up next, and that means you try and optimize at the system level rather than optimize at a much more tough-minded, localized level. However, there is a trade-off to this, because if you move around too much, as Tamara pointed out, there are genuine sacrifices and compromises that are made in terms of learning. And so what Singapore has done is, we found that in the early years of the administrative service, postings were 2 years at the very early level, partly to get the exposure that you pointed out, Patrick, but then about 4 years in the more senior jobs. And we've now kind of really moved away from that. Now, even the early jobs can be between 3 to 5 years. And once you hit director, you might be in a job for at least 5 to 6, possibly even 7 years, to really build the knowledge as well as the relationships. And stakeholders have actually loved this, because the people who suffer most from people moving around all the time is stakeholders, right? And you'd often hear these grumblings to the permanent secretary, right? I've had to retrain your officers, right? Because the stakeholders now find that they don't, the officials don't understand what's going on anymore. One of our ministers joked once, he was Minister for Trade and Industry for about 11 years, and he said that he saw through 5 permanent secretaries. Right? He said they weren't very permanent, right? Compared to what he had been doing. And I think that's where the redressing of this balance is, without sacrificing the importance of and the benefits of actually moving around different domains. So just 2 more quick points which I think are worth highlighting. One is, the other value of a generalist is that they are they're probably better at identifying new and emerging areas than someone who's very, very steeped in a single domain. And I think this is important for government as well, to even identify that climate is a new area of priority, right? Or that strategy is important. In Singapore, we found that we need design thinkers who are looking at citizen-centered, user-centered design. We need experts in citizen engagement. We need experts in futures and complexity science so that they can be more adaptive in their approaches. These often don't come from individual domains. They come from someone who's seeing the breadth of the system and how the interdependencies work across domains. So this leads then to the last point, in which I wanted to reflect a little bit about training. And this is a corollary to the learning point that Tamara emphasized. And I think this is absolutely critical. How do we train policy practitioners in ways that are meaningful? And Singapore's got a pretty extensive system of training, right? The people who come on to either our specialist or generalist leadership tracks will go through training when they first join, within the first year of work. They then do another course for over a year in chunks when they first become team leads. They do a 6-week program as directors, and they do a 6-week program when they become agency heads or DG equivalents. And in all of these, the content is always split into 3, similar to these 3 items here, right? Policy issues, understanding where the overlaps are and where the trade-offs might be. Governance, meaning understanding the role of the state and understanding the role of the machinery of government. And then leadership and organizational development, because so much of your job at both the individual contributor and senior levels is to find ways to maximize team performance. And we found that literacy becomes important as well. All of these, when put together, add up to building a sense of community across these leadership communities. And we found that is really key. The content gets forgotten 2 weeks after a course, because in the age of AI, everything can be overtaken by events. But the relationships stay. Many of them, they'll meet for dinner every quarter. These communities stay and form social capital across which policy gets made, and it lubricates the system in quite amazing ways. So I thought these were worth mentioning, because data, in your other question, Alex, is one aspect of this sharing. But what really matters, I think, is the culture and instincts of joining up across government, whether you are a specialist, generalist, or something in between. And that comes, I think, from this sense of community that people actually have, which training can be a very powerful enabler for.
Can I
Really interesting,
make an observation and difference between Singapore and the UK? You said that the minister had 5 permanent secretaries. In my time as a permanent secretary and government chief scientific advisor for 5 years, I had 4 prime ministers, 6 chancellors, and 9 science ministers.
Absolutely, yes. Yes,
the
an important difference.
As the political cycle waxes and wanes, and it is, he says diplomatic.
I wish you less exciting time.
And it is, clearly the comparisons with Singapore are different in all sorts of ways. But I was going to pick up on one kind of Singapore comparison, which is running through most of your points there was a sense that there was a controlling mind. You talk about job rotations and things. Now, is it that we just look at Singapore and think, oh gosh, that's terribly ordered and all works well? One of the critiques we make of the structure of the civil service, and it's a constitutional question in a way, is that it's very hard for the cabinet secretary, the head of the civil service, to actually make a lot of this stuff happen because it's a distributed system. Is it easier in Singapore?
No, it's not. There is no controlling mind.
Yeah.
I would say that there are ordering conversations. Right. And partly, we're 120,000 strong civil service, so it is a bit more manageable. There's a public service division which manages kind of government-wide HR, sets in place broad rules which individual services can then vary within. But they're also the ones responsible for the leadership track and training. And when I say ordering conversations, what I mean is that there is a sense of they, together with the permanent secretaries, spend a lot of time keeping track of where leaders are moving. Are they getting the right sorts of exposure? Tamara was in Singapore recently and had conversations with many of these practitioners. So I think the conversations are actually what matters. And some of it is about what the system needs. Some of it's also about interest, right? It's about someone saying, I've been a generalist for the last 4 jobs. I've now decided I want to specialize in education. And we've had people move from the administrative track into a specialist track. We've had others who have been urban planners their whole lives and then get kind of pulled into the administrative service community because in the depth that they acquired, they have also developed such a nuanced sense of how the whole system operates that they then become generalists later in their careers. And we find that porosity is really important. So not casting people in stone at any point in their careers. And I know you have thoughts on porosity as well.
Yeah. I thought one of the things that I noticed in Singapore was this more attention and more time on talent management than talent management is the thing, but that real thoughtfulness about people and their careers and where they might move to, which we do elements of, but probably could do just more attentively. And I do think there is something always as a senior leader of ensuring that you are spending enough of your time thinking about people and their careers and mentoring and putting enough of your time into that. So I think there's something for us to learn about that. I did think there was also much more attention to how you do that systems leadership you talked about making those connections. There was, I don't know if it's an experiment, but at the moment, permanent secretaries are also given a second permanent secretary role in another department.
When they start, especially.
Which sounded really good, and so I was really intrigued by this. And how did that in order to sort of break down silos, I have to say, did not appear to be very popular among the sectors, being quite a lot to take on. But there were definitely just thoughts about how do you build those connections, require that explicit way of how do people connect people. And that's why there's something for me about, how do we at least get, have people know how to build multidisciplinary teams and think much more actively. And Patrick and I did stuff about how do we do better sort of systems thinking. So I thought, I thought that was really interesting to see in Singapore.
And that, that sort of development point you talked about, I think is going to be only more important as some of the tasks that allow policy civil servants to develop skills are automated and so on. So actually that sort of transfer of knowledge and skills are even more important. Tamara, very quickly, and then I'll come to questions in the room so Patrick gets a chance to answer one or two. There were quite a few questions online about pay, inevitably. But in this context, if we're moving more towards the profession having standards and requirements, how will that affect pay, recruitment and retention? What role has wage stagnation had in disincentivizing developing a specialism where you have to move between jobs to secure promotion? There's an announcement today about senior civil servants' performance being linked to finding efficiencies in the context of the spending review. So how does pay and reward fit into improving the policy profession?
Yeah, look, pay is challenging, and I think the fiscal context is going to mean it remains really challenging. But I do think that having a framework that is a transparent framework around qualifications will give us a basis actually for being able to think about pay in the profession in the way that it has done in some of the other professions. So I think it's quite important basis for that. I think you mentioned the kind of coverage today of changes in the SCS performance management framework. I think it's not huge changes. We have a framework, and SCS have objectives around finance, also around diversity and so on. And this, it is really important that people are held to account for delivering their objectives. And I think that's what that is about. I think any of us would wish to be kind of held to account for doing that. But as I say, I think we have rewarding careers. We also have good pensions, and I think sometimes the balance between pay and pensions is something that one might want to look at some point, because the pensions, while good, and not something that people necessarily appreciate earlier in their career. So I think there's lots of things to look at in pay, but I do think the framework we're talking about here might be a good basis for having that conversation.
Right. Let's come to some questions in the room. There's one at the back there, then I'll come front there. So, ladies back.
Hello, I'm Aglia Machanskaita, a generalist at DCIT. And I wanted to ask, how do you see the role of AI in the future of policy profession and generalist? Do you think there will be fewer jobs, or do you think it will create new jobs? And also, will this be covered in the training for policy professionals that you were speaking about?
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And we've got a paper coming out in the next couple of days on AI in the policy profession, so keep an eye out for that. There's one at the front here. Just pick up the mic.
Morning. So Chris Pook from Rolls-Royce. As a former civil servant, I've moved from the civil service environment to a business where I'm surrounded by nuclear engineers. And they are desperately looking and thinking about how they can access the broader skills that Tamara was talking about to help broaden their horizons and engage more comprehensively with government and issues around that. So I wondered whether there's anything that government and industry can learn from each other in this space.
Thank you. And there was one more back in the corner there. Sorry, Lauren, to give you an awkward. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Matt Collins, I'm a researcher at Cardiff University. I think the point I'll make is that we've, of course, been here before. Haldane in 1918, Fulton 1968, Professional Policy Making for the 21st Century 1999, Civil Service Reform Plan 2012, and the 12 Actions paper in 2013, amongst many other papers besides, all of which have commented on the scourge of the generalist and the need to get away from it. My question, however, is what is different today?
It's a very good question and one we ask a lot. There are a few things new in civil service reform. Patrick, do you want to pick up on, well, any of those, but particularly sort of AI and government industry?
Yeah, I think AI is going to change jobs. There's no question about that. And it's going to, unlike previous industrial developments, it's going to change jobs in the thinking jobs rather than the manual jobs more. And so the question is how you use that to ensure that that gives more time for humans to do the bit that humans can do. And that, I think, is what we need to really start thinking about very hard. So AI already can do things that would, and I've asked my office to start using AI to produce outline briefings for things, because it can do the whole sort of scope of all the information in a way that humans can't. But it's not human. And therefore, there are things that humans need to do. So I think it's going to change jobs rather than end up with jobs disappearing. I mean, some jobs may disappear and then new jobs will arise. I don't think it's going to be, because every time there's been industrial development, industrial revolution and different, people think jobs are going to go. Well, they change, and this is no different from that. They're going to change quite dramatically, and they're going to affect a part of society which has not been affected before, which is the people who largely use their brains for their work rather than for manual tasks, and that is something that I think we as society need to work out how to deal with. But I've got a very simple rule, which is make sure that whenever you introduce this, you keep saying, what is it that humans can do, and have we given more time back to that?
Any thoughts on the sort of government and industry?
Yeah, well, look, the government industry thing is really important. There's a lot that industry can teach government about how to, particularly on the delivery side of things and the focus side of things and teamwork and all that sort of thing, no question about it. And there's an awful lot that government actually can teach industry as well, because I think government is very, very complicated. And as I said earlier, it's easy to assume policy is an easy thing to do. It's not, it's a very difficult thing to do. And I think that's not, and I didn't appreciate it when I was in industry. I think a better appreciation of what the trade-offs and difficulties are of turning your sort of idea into a policy, I think would help that interaction. I'd love to see more movement of people between the two sectors. I think that would help enormously.
And just picking up on a couple of those things before you go, and then we'll let you go, but send you out on a high. I'm not going to ask you about Elon Musk because I don't want to create a diplomatic incident. But something about what you were talking about there was kind of disruption, the role of disruption in government, in policy making, in delivery in government, the sort of good disruption and bad disruption. It's one of the things I have been thinking about while looking at the US. There is a value in shaking up the state. There is a value in doing things differently, but there are also enormous risks around that. So interested, given your experience, on your reflections on that.
Well, maybe two observations. The first is that, you can get into a sort of Maoist, Trotskyite belief that somehow if you break something better is going to come afterwards. Yeah. And that may be true occasionally. It's not true 10 out of 10 times. So you've got to remember that as you look for disruption. Disruption can be very helpful, but it's not always helpful. And the second thing to say is Mark Sedwell, when he was Cabinet Secretary, I invited him to come and speak to the Chief Scientific Advisors, and he used a very good expression which I think captures it. He said he saw the Chief Scientific Advisors as licensed dissidents inside government. Yeah. And I think you do need the licensed dissidents, the people who are going to challenge and look at things differently. Because without challenge, we end up all thinking the same way, it becomes monolithic, and we end up not really progressing. So that, in turn, speaks to Tamara's point about diversity. None of this is possible without true diversity. Otherwise, everyone's doing the same thing.
Yeah. Fantastic. I said you'd go out on a high. Thank you very much for that. So, thanks, Patrick. So, Tamara, to give you the really straightforward question of why now is different.
So, I mean, I think in all those examples that you gave, we have made progress since that time. I mean, I talked about policy profession. The policy profession has developed hugely over the last 10 years of building the sort of learning experiences and so on, and it creates a platform for what I'm suggesting we need to go further. I do think there is a huge urgency of change in the civil service that we have now. I think the public, they have huge expectations of what needs to happen to get, higher living standards, better public services, and they don't have huge confidence in, it's not just the government, it's also the civil service to deliver it. So I think we're in a period of time when we need to respond to that, and if we're going to respond to that, we need to make some of the changes. I think these changes are really important ones. So I think there's a bit of a burning platform for the civil service to change and to change in this way. I'm hoping that we can do that, but I recognise the problems. I think some of the point is that we shouldn't pretend things are easier than they are. And I take that example of the thing, moving around between departments, and it does, and it deeply annoys stakeholders and so on. But you do have to think, okay, well, how do you actually deliver that? And then how do you deliver it? How are you actually going to do that? How are you going to implement it? Who do you need to bring around to do that? So I think sometimes we've sort of declared things we need to do, but haven't mapped out how we're going to implement it. So, and part of my, you could set a decade to make the fundamental shifts I'm talking about. Feels it's too long, and it sort of is, and we have to make progress in a shorter time frame than that. But I think if you're unrealistic about how you absolutely change the system, you won't do it. So attention to delivery is going to be a part of it.
And Aaron can tell us the answer in a second, but policy profession and AI, is there work going on that at the moment? I know there are lots of trials, and we hear about red box and this kind of stuff.
And how we use it.
How you use it, but also how it will change the profession.
Yes, there's something. I mean, look, some of the kind of training in it actually has been developed and for the policy profession, but also others, and hopefully people have done some of that training. How we sort of apply it in our policy work. There have been various pilots of things that we can use, as you described in the sort of red box programme. But also we are at the moment, literally I think tomorrow, are doing a trial where actually a group of policy professionals, one lot are going to use AI to do a set of tasks, and the others are going to do it without AI to see what productivity improvements we can get. So we're testing that. So there's a lot in how we apply it, but there's also a lot going on in terms of training and support as to how you apply it in your policy areas as well.
Oh, that'd be fun. Interesting experiment.
Yes.
Intrigued by that.
Can I double click on this?
Yeah, no, I was going to come to you. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so I love the AI question. And what I would say to kind of double click on what both Patrick and Tamara have said is, think about what the continuum of policy tasks are, right? In a very stylized way, you could say it's about kind of research, right? Understanding what's out there in the policy world, in the rest of the world especially, and getting a sense of what current practice is like. There's ideation, coming up with new ideas of what you want to do in a policy. There's evaluating those ideas. Then there's writing up the policy papers, which is where some of the productivity gains could be quite significant. And then there's communication of those ideas to the public, to stakeholders, and to others. And if you think of it as that 5 tasks, then what I found in my research and in working with policymakers, and in teaching a class actually in the school I teach in, AI is actually, it functions like a U, right? It is great at ideation, because it's the sentence completion in a probabilistic way that it does brings you great ideas from a large amount of scale. It is okay, but not as great at ideation. It can come up with interesting things that are going on and give you, here are 7 or 8 ideas, but you need to give it quite precise prompts on what problem you're trying to solve. It is awful at evaluation, assessment, which goes to Patrick's point about the human thinking, right? The higher order thought that we need to put in here, even with DeepSeek and all of its simulation of reasoning, doesn't happen in a generative AI. And then the U picks up again after that. It's pretty good at writing. And honestly, if you're writing a short piece, you don't really need to have a huge amount of nuance in it. I would get a first draft out that way, and then have the human being check for factual errors, hallucinations, and it's very, very good at communications. Write a press release in the voice of fill in the blank. It's brilliant at doing that. You choose whatever you want, right? And it's also really good at red teaming, right? Where you say, come up with 7 arguments in opposition to what we've just done, and then it helps a team to prepare much better. So I would strongly encourage these experiments to continue, because I think there's a lot of value that can be derived.
that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I mean, one of the things we worry about a bit is the danger of there being a sort of almost a flattening of creativity with AI, in that if you're, the policy official short of time create something with AI, and it is the sort of, the standard answer. So I think how we unlock creativity is a big part of it as well. We'll do another round of questions in the room. There was one at the front, others a couple there. Matthew first.
Thanks, Alex. I'm Matthew Trimming. I chair an AI company and also do some work on evaluation for the government through Public, the GovTech advisory business. So a very small challenge to you. I think actually, if you use just one tool that's just scraping the internet, your U is absolutely the right shape. I think the real opportunity for all organizations is really to start using it on its own data, and you're using a plurality of tools there. Yeah. So just one observation, which I appreciate wasn't a question, Alex. So here's my question to Tamara. Cat Little talks a lot, quite rightly, about evaluation of policies. And I just wondered whether you'd say a few more words about where the kind of evaluation, so maybe the end of your continuum, or at least, several stages into your continuum, where that fits in your thinking, please.
Thank you. And then I think Sophie at the back.
Thank you. Sophie Dowd from the Institute for Government. The title of this talk is The Death of the Generalist, and we've naturally focused on civil servants. But of course, it's been written in many places that ministers are the ultimate generalists. So I'm curious, what do you think the opportunities and appetite is for building policy capability amongst ministers?
Brilliant. It's a shame Patrick, as the specialist minister extraordinaire, has gone. And I think it's the end of the generalist, not the death of the generalist.
And the difference. Truly generalist comment there, I think.
And I think, just to keep us on the straight and narrow, there was one more. Let's go to the back there.
Hi, Rob Doubleday from the University of Cambridge. I was just reflecting on the term profession and thinking of the kind of self-regulation dimension of profession. And everything you said, Tamara, I think is fantastic. And I wonder if there's additionally space for policy professionals to have, the sort of identity dimension, their own self-governance and self-definition, or is that just going to be impossible in the context of a civil service serving ministers?
Thank you very much. Tamara, evaluation, ministers, and...
Yeah. Actually, before you asked the evaluation, you talked about how we apply AI. I just want to say there's quite a journey for departments to take to get their data into a state that you can use it effectively. So I sort of fear of people jumping too far and not. We've got a lot to do to get some of our basics right around our data and our systems to be able to use AI properly. And I think there's huge responsibility on leaders to really engage on that kind of the digital and data transformation we need in order to be able to use some of the tools. So, evaluation, hugely important. And actually, we have taken a real step up in that kind of understanding. And all of us, and certainly my department, massive more attention and sort of auditing our evaluation and actually ensuring that we are using what we are learning as we develop the next stage. So, and lots of the work that Kat has been doing and sort of central unit there to kind of keep us on that journey is very important. But it's a very significant part of our, so I'm pointing at this because it's the policy profession standards, the evaluation, and that as part of the policy cycle. That is one of the things that you wouldn't be able to get away without knowing if we require it. It's certainly part of the kind of induction and 101 evaluation is part of that. Then the question about ministers. Well, it's good that we're sitting here in the Institute for Government that's done a lot actually to support ministers, including in my own department, to do a bit of kind of training and so on, which I think maybe gives them a bit of a taster for that. But you know, it is the fact that, you know, they and sometimes are not there for huge amounts of time and don't always come certainly with the knowledge of kind of how some of the policy making systems work. But it's part of our job as civil servants to kind of guide them on that journey. And that's, again, one of the things you need to learn as a policy professional is how best to do that and support ministers on that journey. I would definitely think, you know, the more that could be done and maybe more formal learning, the better. But IFG have definitely made a good start on that. On Rob, on the kind of that identity, question. I mean, part of why I think we should have one big sign up and everybody has to see themselves as part of a profession is about people establishing their identity. I have a huge view that, certainly for me, I am more productive and more resilient when I'm part of a community, and even more so when I'm part of multiple communities. And that's in my outside life, but also in my working life. So I'm part of my team, I'm part of my department, I'm a civil servant, and I'm part of a profession. So I think doing a lot to kind of develop that identity is really important. I think that we're going to try and do also more for people to feel even more strongly part of the civil service community, the civil service code at the heart of that, and that kind of identity as a civil servant, what it means to be a civil servant. I think you'll be seeing more work and more on that. So I think see the policy profession within that.
Thanks. And Aaron, I'll give you the last word in a minute, but there's one quick question I thought it was worth asking tomorrow because it goes to the heart of the sort of analysis of the problem, which is from Michelle Doyle-Wildman. Has the civil service done a skills audit? Is there a sense of the actual gap in skills that need to be addressed? I mean, that goes to your, goes to your remarks, but the kind of, do you feel the civil service is kind of regularly, systematically looking at the skills it needs? We all say, well, we need more technical skills or digital skills. What's the mechanism for doing that?
So, I mean, there's the individuals and then there's organisational. I think individually, the policy profession done a lot so that you can go on the website, use that, assess skills, and you should be doing that as part of the, as part of development conversations, and hopefully this CPD requirement of the SCS will require that. One of the reasons why I'm very keen on the sort of these policy capability reviews that we've been piloting is that it does that. It looks at your policy making capability in a department, goes where are the gaps, and it has emerged its skills. So as I say, data literacy emerged in more than one department. So I think the combination of the individual and the organisational is really important, but it's a really important point.
I would also say, Alex, just on skills audits, right? It's important to not overdo it, and because you can so finely granulate sets of skills that we start to lose a sense of the forest for the trees. And skills are part of a body of knowledge for a reason, right? The body has to be coherent in how it all comes together. And if you overdo that, I mentioned this because I'm on DCIT's advisory panel for the redesign of the digital center of government, and one of the comments I remember giving them was on one of my extremely free afternoons in Oxford. I just went to the DCIT website and looked up some of the skills that they had listed there, and under data analytics there were 56 different jobs, and you just think that's probably too many, and they've reviewed it now. It's a much more rationalized set at the moment, so the openness to feedback was fantastic. But I remember thinking that's an example of how if you over granulate, then you actually end up with real problems because you don't have a sense of how the skills come together.
So some people, when they have extremely free afternoons in Oxford, might crack open a bottle of wine or something,
but would you invite them there?
Is there anything you want to say about evaluation in particular? That was the point.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, isn't it? I mean, there's an interesting process at work in Singapore now where evaluation, for now at least, comes under the Ministry of Finance, given that they're trying to figure out value for money, and so that function sits with them. But I think what's really savvy about what they're doing is they're trying to build a movement out of it and a sense of community, right? So they've said we have a system in Singapore which we call the reinvestment fund. So we negotiate budgets once every 5 years, and then 1% of the budget is not given to each agency. They only get 99% of what they ask for. The remaining 1% remains in this fund, and you have to then apply for it if you're doing things that are innovative and fit particular whole of government priorities. And one of the priorities in the last few years has been to develop evaluation capabilities, where the Finance Ministry will actually say, if you are applying for that, we will fund extra posts, basically. And what we often need in Singapore is not additional budget, it's actually additional people to do the work. And so in building up this, they've then said, all right, we'll fund different people in different parts of the agencies, but they come together every quarter or so to exchange thoughts on how exactly evaluation is different in the different domains that they serve. And I think this has helped to build a sense of how varied it can be, but also what the common skills and common principles look like. So I think that's worth keeping in mind, right? That as we build communities, it's valuable to sometimes do that as part of the building of new capabilities, because then you start to find the cross-pollinations that can exist across different government agencies.
Thank you very much. We've got loads more questions we could ask, but we'll have to leave it there. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you to Patrick in his absence, and to Tamara for particularly sharing those thoughts at the start on the policy profession and everything else. There'll be a live stream of this event on our website shortly, and we'll put it up on our other channels. Also have a look at the website for some other excellent events and reports. That AI paper will be up there shortly. We've also got a discussion coming up on something I think is really interesting for the civil service, the duty of candour, which is coming down the track. Patrick is back again with us in March to talk about how the government can boost growth in science-based industries and lots of other things going on as well. So thank you again to the panel. Thank you to everybody here in the room and to those on the live stream and ask questions. Cheers.